testing for radon and subsequent home remediation are sequentially and technically well developed. Empirical studies and also national action reports point to a rather low radon testing and remediation by residents and homeowners. This indicates that more attention is needed to societal aspects of radon and NOR management. For instance, risk perception, risk communication, health communication, behavior. This online session will provide an overview of the methods that have been applied so far for investigating societal aspects for radon and NOR exposure situation, as reported in scientific articles. And this session will also critically reflect on the methodological state of the art and discuss future research needs with the most influential and leading researchers in the field. This session will contribute to the development of new approaches to better address technical, health, and societal aspects of radon and NOR exposure situations. Before we move on to the presentations of our researchers, I will provide some practical information on this session. First of all, you should know that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available afterwards on the RICOMET and SHARE websites. Second, this session consists of two main parts. We start with 6 presentations on methods related to societal aspects of radon and NOR. Then we will have a short break, and then this will be followed by a panel discussion. Our panelists are Professor Dr. Heavy David, Head of School of Psychology in Trinity College Dublin of the University Dublin in Ireland, Professor Neil Weinstein, retired from Rutgers University in United States of America, and Dr. Boris de Hanshutter from Federal Agency for Nuclear Control in Belgium, but also management board member of the European Radon Association. The input for today's session is provided by you. If you have any question or comments for our researchers or experts, you can type in the chat or in our chat moderator, Robe, will then pass these questions to me and the panelists. As an audience member, you cannot use a microphone or webcam. I think that Mary Chell, who is now our responsible for all this IT technology, I think that Mary can now turn on the first presentation, which is provided by PhD candidate Melissa Muric from University of Antwerp.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here with me today. My name is Melissa Muric, and I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Antwerp in SCKCN. I'm here to give you a short presentation about the methodological challenges my colleague and I uncovered while reviewing social research in the field of radon. The rationale behind our study comes down to the notion of evidence-based policy, a hot topic as more and more voices are calling for policies and interventions that are based on the latest scientific evidence, experience and theories, so that we can more effectively manage the risk from radon. A pillar for such policy is scientific evidence, and in particular social scientific evidence, because risk management in essence is social. The responsibility to test and mitigate lies with people, and we see that currently the uptake of these protective measures is low. So we need better understanding of their traits, their behaviors, and what motivates them, which we can obtain through social science research. However, if we want to know how well we can translate this knowledge into policy, we need to have understanding of our knowledge base. How much evidence do we have currently, and what is the quality of our evidence? Quality is defined in methodological terms. Was the risk of bias, which can distort findings, assessed and minimized, and were appropriate methodological tools used? To answer these questions, we systematically collected and described methodological approaches used in social science and humanities studies in the field of radon. This review was conducted within the framework of the Radon project, and we would like to acknowledge the contributions of all those involved. Our review process went as follows. We first searched for databases on social science articles. Due to the centrality of methodology, we also searched based on method keywords. Initially, we had 17,000 articles, and after screening, we were left with 155, which were relevant to us. These were articles published between 1987 and 2020 that described at least to a minimum their methodology, that studied a social topic, and that were published in the English language. In all of those 155, at least one of these topics shown on the slide was studied. We see that the field is dominated by an interest in risk perceptions and that behaviors are studied to a lesser extent. There were also only 32 explanatory studies, which can offer high scientific evidence into what motivates people to test and mitigate. In general, there were 128 quantitative studies, 16 qualitative, and 11 mixed methods in our review. Now that we've seen the range of topics that people get questions about, we can talk about response bias. The definition is shown on the slide. Response bias is especially prevalent in self-reporting, and we've seen that in our review, 83% of the articles used surveys. However, it was very difficult to assess the degree of response bias and to identify best practices in avoiding them, because frequently authors failed to describe the questions they used, answering categories, and the sequence in which they presented questions. All of these things produce and can inform on bias. So what we'll do instead is give examples of two common biases, acquiescence bias and order effect bias. Acquiescence bias is also known as the yes-saying bias. It's the tendency of people to answer in the affirmative if they are unsure about a statement. In radon, we have a lot of statements regarding awareness, such as, have you heard of radon, and do you know that radon may cause a health hazard? It's very easy for people to answer that they do, even though they don't, especially since that's the socially desirable thing to do. But luckily, there's a way to avoid this type of bias. It's by not asking such subjective awareness questions, but rather more objectively assess people's knowledge through, for example, quizzes with questions like, is radon a gas? The second type of bias is the order effect bias. It means that the order in which questions and answering categories are presented can affect the way that people answer to questions. When we assess relative risks, we present multiple risks to people, and the order in which we present these risks matters, because there is a recency effect in which the last item on the list is better remembered, and a primacy effect in which the first item on the list is better remembered. And if you ask people on questions on how familiar they are with risks, we see how this type of bias can matter. And if we, after this question, also ask a question to rate the dangerousness of a risk, we can also see how the previous question can affect this question. But there are also ways to avoid this type of bias, and that is through randomization of the sequence in which we present the risks and also the questions. However, be sure that you make sure that you only randomize within modules on the same topic. Now, while we can minimize response bias, we can never completely avoid it. However, there are other measures which can tell us better how well designed and our instruments are and how well they performed, namely validity and reliability. Validity refers to the extent that we actually measure what we intend to measure in the real world, and reliability is a measure of consistency. Do we get the same answers if we retake the same test? We actually know very little about the reliability and validity of our instruments in the field, because only 23 authors assessed reliability, mainly the Cronbach's alpha, and only 11 assessed validity through factor analysis and a modified Delphi panel. So what this means is that we don't know how well designed our instruments were, so we don't know how much we can trust the findings which are obtained from these instruments. We also looked at where our evidence comes from. We see that our research was conducted in the northern hemisphere and that there is a concentration of research. Nearly 70% of the studies were conducted in the US alone. The country with the second most article was the United Kingdom, then Italy, then Canada, and then Sweden. The remaining 20 studies were conducted in 13 different countries. What this also means is that the majority of our findings are from one country. the United States, and that most of our instruments were also developed here. And that if we want to use these instruments, we require validation, because socio-demographic characteristics and also languages affect psychometric property tests. It is also very important for us to control and describe the setting if we want to have our findings be more applicable to multiple settings which are similar. We also looked at to whom questions were asked within those countries. The majority of research focused on the general residential population, but there was also some interest in indoor radon in schools, and also in the attitudes and estimations of health professionals and other experts such as researchers. If we want to know if we can use the answers that people give from these groups to inform policy, we also need to know how representative their answers are to the attitudes and behaviors that live in the population. If we want a sample that's highly representative, we need to use a probability sampling strategy. This was done in 59 articles. However, in 106, non-probability sampling strategies were used. This means that the sample and also the findings are potentially biased and distorted. Examples of this bias are shown on this slide, but also what we observed next to the frequent use of non-probability sampling techniques is that there is often a misfit between the chosen sampling strategy and the research aims. Such as in the first example, there they wanted to study the general population, yet they sampled parents. And in the second example, while this shows better practice in terms of the fit between research aim and strategy, here as well there was a significant bias because studies were left in doctors' offices and in pharmacies. There was a bias towards people with more access to health resources and higher educated people, for example, which generally have, for example, higher knowledge of radon. However, there is also a misfit which is a bit less intuitive, and this is shown in the third and the fourth example. In the third example, they wanted to assess the knowledge and testing behaviors of the general population, so they sampled from the general population. They even conducted a nationally representative survey. However, on a lot of questions, the responses were low, so the sample size declined significantly, which produced a higher standard error and made the study less representative for the population, especially with questions related to testing and mitigation. So that this shows that large nationally representative studies are not always the best to study these kind of topics. Sometimes it's even better to have a convenience sample of testers and mitigators of people living in high radon risk areas. And although these samples are not representative for non-testers, this is not always problematic from a practical standpoint. However, we do need to be aware that setting matters, and that, for example, the reference levels differ from country to country. So if we want to apply the instruments and make use of these findings to inform policy, we need to be very aware of the context in which the study was conducted. Now we're at the end. I'm just gonna recap briefly, but first I want to say that I hope that if you take anything away from the study, that it then is that in order for us to have evidence-based policy, we need a solid scientific evidence and we need to use solid methodologies. From this review, we now learned that many studies do not have solid methodology in terms of assessing reliability, validity, risk of bias, and being transparent in their methods and sampling techniques used. While this is problematic, thanks to the review, we do now have a synthesis of the knowledge and of the instruments. And although we still need to validate, improve, and adapt these instruments to be used on a larger scale, on a different scale, in a different setting, we now know what the foundation is upon which we can build. As for the future, we need to strengthen and expand our knowledge base. And we call upon all of you to use standardized instruments, to test your instruments, to describe your methods, and also to conduct more comparative research and more social science research, and especially social science research that's explanatory for testing and mitigations, as this is definitely lacking. And if we do so, we already overcome many of the challenges to evidence-based policy. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Melissa, for this really insightful overview of the studies. Amazing, 17,000 articles you needed to read, and you got out only what, 300, around 300 articles that they were really useful to get insights and inputs from the societal and humanities studies related to radon and norm. And you pointed out also an interesting finding, which is that only few solid, methodologically solid studies were inside of this sample. So there is definitely a lot of work for us to do still. However, Melissa, I would like to ask you for your advice. What is really a problem in these studies, or for us researchers in the field of societal aspects, when we apply a questionnaires in the field, is that okay, people, they are more and more aware about the radon. So when we ask them, have you ever heard about radon and what did you hear and so on? Then we lose, let's say, up to 50% of people, because let's say on average 50% of people don't know. And then those that they know, we want to actually, we are investigating the real behavior, whether they test or mitigate. But with the questionnaire, we only, for instance, in our study in Belgium, only 15% of the radon-prone area responded living in the radon-prone area, they tested or mitigate, only 15%. So out of 50% that they know, have heard about the radon, we got only 15% that they really tested and mitigated. And if we, as a social scientist, if we measure intention to behavior change or attitude, this is still not a behavior. There is still full chain before people will really apply. We know that the attitude, you can have a positive attitude to charity, but still you don't give the money to the charity. Exactly the same is for the radon. So you as methodologist, what would you suggest us? How can we improve our sample, our people, respondents, that they are responding to our questions, that the model will be still okay, that we can predict how people will behave and what is influential for the real behavior, testing and mitigation, protecting people to get lung cancer at the end. So how can we improve this?
Thank you for the very interesting question, Tanya. Well, I would say we definitely have to ask more objective questions about behavior if you want to study what influences it. So not only study behavioral intentions, as you said, and with those people that do know what radon is and have heard of it and are knowledgeable about it and are aware. We are now in the stage that they are aware but not yet testing, and some are. So those people can get these kind of questions. The remaining people that have not, we can still ask questions about behavioral intentions, but here the context matters. I think in certain areas or certain countries, we are further in the radon actions stages. Let's say we have a lot of interventions, and there we can actually learn from larger samples if you have more comparative research of what matters to change behaviors. Because although I did say that we need to validate our results because they don't necessarily apply to other areas, if you have more comparative research, these findings might be more universal on what barriers there are or what facilitates behavior change. So I would argue for more comparative research in that regard. Maybe for those that are knowledgeable of radon, really questions regarding behavior, so not behavioral intentions. And then in the last part, you could also work with behavioral intentions for the remaining information that you will
Okay,
need,
Melissa,
although one needs to be aware of this.
thank you for this response. We also received one question in the chat area from Ferdiana Hoti. She's saying, you argue that to avoid acquaintances bias, we should present questions in the form of a quiz. Don't you think that if we do this, people might feel pressure to have the right answer and answer one of the options randomly, hoping they get the answer right?
Of course, there are always biases, and I think I also said that we can never completely avoid it. However, I still think that if you have multiple items and you more objectively assess people's knowledge, you have more information about their awareness, and then you can say, okay, we know actually that awareness is not enough to get them to test, but I do think that it is a first stage of making people aware. They don't necessarily have to know everything about radon, but it's still a better measure to know whether they really have heard about radon than if you ask them just the question, have you heard about radon? So it's still, people don't have to get all the questions right, I think, and know everything about radon to still test, because I think we already know that there are many stages in between where there is a value action gap that which we now know we have to tackle to get people to test and mitigate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for these responses. I would just like to say that we have also other types of the tools, for instance, qualitative studies that we can go in the field, or even open answers, and then you can test people what they have heard about it. We apply this also in the Radon project.
Definitely, and mixed methods and the combination of both. Yes. To yeah.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. To open our webinar with this quite heavy presentation, but now we go on to this gap that you already pointed out, value action gap. I think that the next presentation will speak a bit about it. The next presentation is also from PhD candidate Sophie Eppers, also from University of Antwerp. So Mary, you can project it.
Hello. My name is Sophie, and today I would like to discuss radon health communication and why evaluation methods of radon communication are crucial. Before we get into the methodological part, I want to give a very brief introduction in radon health communication and why we need it. As radon testing and remediation rates remain still too low, the renewed Euratom directives require European member states to develop and implement a national radon action plan, including implementing communication strategies to increase the awareness about radon among the public. While including communication in these radon action plans is really a great step forward, we cannot lose sight over the complexity of radon communication. As it is stated in the directive, the communication initiatives should increase awareness among the public. However, when we look at the literature, awareness does not always result in behavior. And what does behavior in the context of radon even mean? If you break down the different steps that people have to undertake, we see that there's actually far more to it. People need to decide to test, they have to order tests, perform them correctly, and send them back for analysis, and so on. It is for that reason that investigating the appropriate communication strategy is really crucial, so that people are more likely to complete the required steps. But before you can decide on a communication strategy, it is good to have a look at the existing evidence and its quality. And this is where the evaluation part comes in. When it comes to designing and evaluating campaigns, 4 steps are distinguished. In the first step, the scope is decided. This includes the objectives formulated in a smart way in the target group. For instance, we want to increase radon testing behavior by X%. In the second step, the campaign is developed in an iterative way. Formative research is crucial in terms of evaluating messages, channels, objectives, senders, and even implementation strategies before they are sent to the wide public. Think about cultural appropriateness, but also, is the message relevant for the target audience, and how complicated or easy is the message to understand? Maybe the sender of the message is not trusted by the general public, or maybe the message targets the wrong determinants. And the only way to prevent these things from happening on a larger scale is to evaluate the campaign beforehand through formative research. Additionally, outcome evaluation, where the efficacy of the campaign is measured, is also very important already in the development stage. Why? To catch problems early on. While formative research takes place prior and during the actual development, the outcome evaluation is thus at a later point in time when the campaign development is nearly finished. Outcome evaluation ideally takes place in a randomized controlled trial experiment, so in a more controlled, limited setting in which then the campaign is the stimulus. In case the campaign shows not to be effective, the development stage starts over, hence its iterative character. But in case it is effective, we can go to the next stage, namely implementation. In this case, the campaign, as developed in the second stage, is implemented in the setting it was developed for. Most of the time, this is a country, it could also be a state or province, or even just be a town. And finally, the campaign is then evaluated on the process and outcome level. Regarding the outcome, this means the effectiveness of the campaign based on the objectives defined earlier. This can be based on real behavior measures, for instance, the number of tests ordered or the number of tests resent to the lab. The process evaluation, on the other hand, evaluates everything that is needed in order to actually measure an effect. So this includes measuring reach, whether it reached enough people and the right people, but also context. Is there a pandemic or another event dominating the news that needs people's attention? Was the campaign implemented correctly, etc.? So now we know why communication is needed and how the evaluation of campaigns should take place. Now let's have a look at the current existing evidence regarding communication campaigns in the context of indoor radon. We conducted a systematic review to explore the existing evidence about communication campaigns targeted at homeowners specifically. We focus on peer-reviewed articles that focus on mass media communication. Peer-reviewed because we wanted to have a look at the most explicit evidence that was available. Mass media such as TV, brochures, radio, internet, because they have the potential to not only increase awareness, but also change behavior. Within these papers, we then looked at the objectives, whether they focus on information requests or testing behavior or mitigation behavior. We also looked at the campaign design, what type of messages did they use, the channels they used, and whether it was based on communication or behavioral theories. But what is of course most relevant in this context is we analyze the methodology they used to evaluate the communication campaigns and what that means for building on knowledge. We used the PRISMA statement to assess eligibility of the more than 1,700 results yielded as a result of our search in multiple databases. We ended up with 40 studies, which equal 27 campaigns. And when we take a look at the first stage, the scope, we see that all campaigns were aimed at homeowners, which is logical as this was one of the inclusion criteria. Studies were published between 1987 to 2020 with a gap between 2001 and 2010. Also, 2020 out of 27 campaigns took place in the United States. Most of the campaigns aimed to increase intention to test and testing, while only few focus on mitigation behavior. Well, when we look at the second stage, the development stage, and look at the formative research, we see that only 7 out of 27 campaigns applied this in the form of pilot studies or focus groups. The reasons presented in the papers as to why they performed formative research also highlights the importance of it. For instance, researchers use formative research to identify important themes or to refine messages or even develop messages with the target audience themselves. In the second stage, the outcome is also quite often measured. 17 out of the included campaigns were evaluated as controlled campaigns or field campaigns, meaning that they adopted quasi-experimental designs in either a controlled setting, for instance, a lab in a university, or a more natural setting, for instance, a town or city, or even multiple towns. And because they adopted a quasi-experimental design, we will learn most of this category. So let's have a deeper look at these papers or these campaigns. So of all the quasi-experimental designs, we see that only 9 allow us to draw conclusions about the results. Why is that? What we need ideally is a pre-measure and a control condition, or no pre-measurement, but random assignment to control condition. This means that only 9 campaigns can attribute any change in behavior or behavioral intention to the campaign itself. And this only due to the method they chose to evaluate the campaign with. And this is only in the development stage. When we look at the process evaluation of implemented campaigns, only 2 incorporated measures to see whether the audience actually understood the message. Reach website metrics can, of course, also be considered process measures. In terms of behavior change, we see that behavior change was in 4 cases measured by self-reported behavior through interviews and surveys and direct behavior. And in 6 cases, only by direct behavior, examples of which are website metrics, tests ordered or resent, mitigations implemented, and so on. However, because process evaluation is so limited, conclusions are hard to draw from these implemented studies, as so many parameters could have had an influence, but we just don't know about them. So to summarize, what can we learn from these results? So the evaluation from the development phase is still lacking when it comes to methodology. This leads to very similar communication approaches that were tested, being a very informative, technical approach, very limited focus on emotions or social norm, and the use of leaflets was by far the most popular one. However, if we are not able to draw conclusions in this phase, it is not unusual that the same approach is tested again and again. As a contradictory example, a few researchers show that extensive methodologies are in fact possible. They both use field campaigns with pre-measure and post-measure and a control condition. So what we need is just not impossible. Other campaigns also stand out due to their innovative channels, such as smartphones or social media. But what we actually need is evidence-based research and solid methodology so that we can explore new approaches, new strategies, and new innovative communication campaigns so that we are actually able to let the field of radon communication grow and inspire and inform campaign makers about best practices and eventually reduce lung cancer as a result of radon. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophie. Really amazing, research. I mean, 1,700 campaigns reported in the scientific articles, and then at the end, something more than 40 articles that they somehow were able to report at least some part of the evidence-based facts. What I wanted to ask you is, I mean, it relates to the legal requirements. Now, all European countries, they are required related to the basics implication and transposition of the basic safety standards to develop their own communication campaigns to increase the awareness and also to improve the stakeholder engagement and so on in the long-term exposure situations. But you are pointing out that this whole process, it's somehow quite long. You need to first measure, to have a baseline, what is out there at this moment that we want to change. And then they go from scope to develop, implement, and also evaluate. Do you have any idea how long does this take? How long is this process if it's not in the quasi-experiment?
It's difficult to say because when it comes to the national radon action plans, I would recommend that people like us, like researchers, do the research in the development stage, and then we can provide insights and recommendations to the actual practice. So let's say that the development stage is actually our job, and then we can recommend best practices so that they can implement it, which would in that case also increase or make the process a bit faster for the actual radon action plans requirements.
And what would you suggest now, I mean, as a health communication experts, what would you suggest now to authorities in Europe? How can they approach, where they should start, who they should consult, how they can improve their communication campaigns, which for up till now, it looks like that they were more developed on the gut feelings than on the evidence-based, theory-based or strategic communication.
Yes, well, first of all, I would, of course, recommend that they consult research, but as you can see from the systematic review, there is actually very few hard evidence on what works or what doesn't work. But what we do know from the existing evidence is that informative campaigns work kind of, but there is still a lot of room for improvement. And I would highly recommend to test campaigns with emotions or a social norm, or maybe with goal-oriented campaigns and stuff like that.
Okay, Sophie, thank you so much for your presentation and your contribution to this session. Now we will go with the next presentation, which discusses the norms. Okay, radon is also norm, but Catrinel Turcanu, she will present the societal aspects of also T norms and as an overlooked research field.
Hello, my name is Catrinel Turcanu. I work for the Belgian Nuclear Research Center, and this presentation summarizes the results of a systematic literature review conducted on social studies of norm. And as we will see from this review, this is actually an overlooked research field that deserves more attention. Many industries worldwide process raw materials containing naturally occurring radioactive material, producing a variety of products, byproducts, discharges, residues, and wastes. And managing norm is a complicated societal challenge, not only from a technical point of view, but also from a social point of view. For instance, we have to deal with different perceptions of risk, different interpretations and expectations of how the norm is managed and what the end state of a remediated site will be. It is also complex to communicate about low radiation doses or to engage stakeholders that are, for instance, opposing environmental remediation. And social studies on norm can help in that respect because they help identify and address risk perceptions and social values and concerns. They also explain the complexity of radiological protection behaviors. They identify cultural sensitivities. They help improve communication and stakeholder engagement, contribute with historical perspectives and long-term thinking, and they are also a very important component of sustainable environmental management. Within the framework of the radon norm project, a systematic review was carried out to understand what is the state of the art, what do we know from social studies on norm, what kind of social studies are being conducted, what are the gaps, and what can we learn from what exists currently. A first finding here was that it's actually challenging to find social studies on norm because the research is poorly indexed and is dispersed over many academic disciplines. And so in order for us to conduct a thorough review, we kept a broad search. So we used 3 types of keywords. One was the keyword radioactive. Then there were keywords related to norm, for instance, to norm industries like oil and gas. And also there were keywords relating to social science methods. And here a special search was done for survey and experiment, as these words are also used in many natural science studies, but without reference to social considerations. And the review proceeded in 3 stages. In a first stage, scientific databases were searched, and this search was common for norm and radon. After that, articles relating to norm were selected. We obtained 14 articles. This excluded a bulk of articles on indoor radon, but included, for instance, radon in water. And also the focus was on social studies supported by empirical data. And finally, we did back snowballing. We looked at the list of references of these articles and we identified 6 additional ones that were initially overlooked, leading to a total of 20 scientific peer-reviewed papers. What is striking is that from these 20 studies, which are surprisingly little over a period of several decades, 16 of these studies were conducted in the United States and only 4 in other countries, 1 in Romania, 1 in Germany, 1 in Australia, and 1 in the United Kingdom. And only 10 of these studies are from the past decade, despite the increasing attention to norm remediation, and various aspects, technical aspects relating to norm. We see that the social studies are actually lagging behind. There is a variety of fields and topics addressed. One important domain was uranium mining and milling. Here, for instance, studies addressed how media reports about these incidents, especially when they occur in communities with who are vulnerable from a social or economic point of view. Also, workers' information about an exposure to radon was a topic of research. Furthermore, legacy sites from nuclear weapons production in the United States were the topic of 3 studies. And here they looked, for instance, at citizens' preference towards different remediation options or their actual and desired level of involvement in decision-making. Other studies addressed coal ash storage site. Here, actually, it was one independent data set, and which was addressed from 3 different angles. And one of these angles was to look at parents' perceptions of risks related to this environmental contamination. Then there were studies in oil and gas exploration industries. For instance, very interesting, some of these studies addressed hydraulic fracturing, and one study regarded offshore oil and gas platform in the United Kingdom and looked at workers' perceptions of various risks, including radiological risks. Other industries were addressed in 3 studies. They looked, for instance, at side mining legacies and how people link their own health problems with environmental contaminants. And another study looked at communication challenges concerning historical legacy sites from the chemical industry. And finally, 3 studies regarded norm in water. They looked, for instance, whether people test for radon or what are their preferences towards different policy options to deal with this issue. The studies also allow to draw some methodological considerations. Some weaknesses were observed. For instance, in some quantitative samples, they used a small sample volume. In one article, even it was equal to 15 different items, which were treated quantitatively nevertheless. Convenience samples, not including vulnerable groups or different categories of stakeholders treated together, for instance, experts together with citizens and other stakeholders. In some cases, variables were not clearly explained or the analytical framework was not clear. Also, we noticed very few explanatory studies that would bring more in-depth insights into why, for instance, people decide to test for radon in water and take remedial actions. Also, the formulation of items in questionnaires was weak in some cases. As an example, a knowledge questionnaire contained several items, but yes was the correct answer for all items. We could also identify some good practices, for instance, good design with a clear analytical framework and also reporting on the reliability and validity of the constructs used. The use of well-established scale in the literature is another example of good practice. Some studies included ethical reflections, for instance, how to preserve the privacy, and one study reported having used, for instance, gateway processes to preserve the anonymity of the respondents. Few studies reported about obtaining informed consent from their respondents, and also some specific considerations on vulnerable groups. Furthermore, testing and validating the design was reported in a few studies, like as, for instance, conducting a pilot study for a survey or developing communication material used in an experiment with the engagement of relevant stakeholders. Attention to context was also an important good practice. For instance, understanding communities not through their geographical boundaries, but as social spaces they occupy. Some selected findings that could be withdrawn from the studies. We see that norm legacy sites raise concerns, and these are not always directly related to radioactivity. In some cases, they are related to types of pollution that can be more readily observed through human senses. This was, for instance, the case of the studies on the coal ash storage site. But we also see that there is low awareness of radiation from natural sources among the general public, but not only among the general public, but also healthcare providers or even workers. There are various risk perceptions depending on the population groups addressed or the particular norm situation. For instance, we see that people who reside in the area containing a legacy site for a longer time, generally they have higher risk perception than residents who have spent less time in the area. There are also some aspects relevant to the perceptions of risk, to concern and preferences towards remediation and management options. And these are residents' own health, their children's health, the cost of remediation options, equity and justice, and participation. And related to that, we saw, for instance, that the distribution of power or the unfairly perceived distribution of power was an important aspect relating to living in a community with a norm legacy site. We also saw that some studies reported distrust from residents towards authorities and polluting industries, which may lead to opposition to remediation plans. And also a very interesting result of an experiment bringing empirical evidence that information reflecting a wider range of values rather than simply technoscientific facts is more helpful for people to make choices about cleanup options in a way that really matters to them. In conclusion, norm management is a complex issue and it requires input from various disciplines, including social sciences and humanities. However, there are currently very few social studies in the literature, and they have limited norm and geographical coverage. There are some norm industries that are not at all at the moment reflected in the current studies. And there is a need also to follow up some of the old studies, because in the meantime, there may be social, cultural, regulatory, and other changes that may have occurred. And also, there are very few specific measurement scales for latent constructs, which were developed specifically for norm. And those existing, they mainly focus on knowledge. And we know that this is important, but there are other things like other variables such as social norms or moral considerations that are more important. And this brings about the need for research in various ways. First, from a methodological point of view, we need methodologies to identify and address social considerations. And then there is a need for situated studies focusing on particular norm situations that have not been addressed so far. And then last but not least, most of the studies deal with cross-sectional studies. So there is a need for longitudinal surveys looking at how concerns among the population develop or change with time. And the RADONORM project will do an important step in that respect. So I invite you to stay up to date with the latest scientific research conducted in RADONORM. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Katrinil, for this interesting overview and astonishing overview of where we definitely will see that there are societal aspects of norm and overlooked research field. You pointed out really nice conclusions, and I think that at this session we can also invite researchers to investigate also some other norms, exposure situations, for instance, I don't know, geothermal industry or norm for building material. This is definitely not explored. We didn't find anything. And I was also surprised with so many legacy sites that they exist in Europe. For instance, Horizon 2020 project territories, but also radon norm. They are mapping these contaminations, small contaminations and bigger contaminations. And I think that already in Belgium, we have hundreds of sites that they are contaminated with norms and T-norms. We will ask this later, our panelists, how many, but still the social studies are not investigating how people feel about it, how they are, what are their concerns and so on. Why do you think that this is so? Why is so underexplored area? Is this so complex, or what is going on, Katrinel?
Well, I was asking myself this question, and I know that this is usually a sensitive issue. We see that, for instance, also in projects of the International Atomic Energy Agency, where people come together to discuss the social aspects of norm, it is not easy to make this information publicly available. In principle, it is required to do a social survey, for instance, when you are conducting a remediation project, but this information is not readily accessible to the public, and also it may in fact lack the scientific backup for the methodology used, and this is a pity, because first we could then assess these methodologies and improve them, and on the other hand make the results of the research more available to the community. We cannot learn from this experience if they are not shared.
Mm-hmm. So there is also not only really in the nuclear field, but also in the norm field, there is some secrecy and questioned transparency and openness.
I think there is more to work in this area. Yes.
Yeah, we got an interesting comment from. Can you go up? We got a remark to make from Bogoslav. He said that actually uranium mining and mining is part of a nuclear fuel cycle, is usually not considered in terms of norm. Also, nuclear weapons consequences do not fall into the norm category at all. I know this problem as social science researchers. I'm often, contacted by experts in this field, and I realized that, for instance, also production of radium production also doesn't, according to some legislation in some countries. Other countries, they use this differently. And here is also another societal issue that it's worth to investigate, why there is no harmonization between these definitions, what is norm and what is not norm, and it's different from in Europe than to in America, or what is your feeling, Katrinel?
Well, I mean, for sure, this is worthwhile investigating. I would also say that we took a sort of broader interpretation of norm here, not necessarily sticking to one particular, we took the norm not from a regulatory point of view, but more generally in order to see what is there and yeah, what can we learn, because you see there are very few studies. If we would really stick to what is defined as norm, we'll probably get to only 5 or 6, which is also a finding. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we wanted to have a broader scope of review, because as you see, we started with thousands of articles when we arrived with
but at the end we are, I mean, the goal is to investigate radiation protection and actually for the person who lives in one village which is contaminated due to the phosphogistum industry or radium production, doesn't matter. I mean, we need to investigate how people feel, how what are their concepts, how do they protect themselves, how they live there in this environment, and how we can help them to protect themselves or to decrease the concerns that they potentially are not important. There is also one comment in the chat area from Ivica Perlic from Croatia. He's sending us a good news. He said that there is a now new approach regarding oil and gas industry in a new International Atomic Energy technical documents. So the social issues are more and more present and more important. Okay, so thank you, Katrinil, for your presence today. Maybe you can just say, you can invite for the afternoon session now. It's your opportunity.
Yes. Thank you very much, Tanya. So the next RICOMET session will be dedicated to participatory approaches to environmental decision making. So I think we will address some of the important issues about what communities are facing with and how to increase engagement in decision making on environmental remediation, which includes also norm remediation.
Yes, and that norm are more and more also investigated by social scientists. It also indicates that our next RICOMET 2022 will be co-organized together with Norm 10 conference in Utrecht next year. So there, the social science will enter also and investigate also this field more and more, and we will contribute to a better norm management in Europe and worldwide. Thank you, Katrinil. And now we go to the next presentation, which is prepared also by PhD candidate Christine Kelly de Gronchi from Trinity College from the University of Dublin in Ireland. Please, Mary.
Hello, my name is Kristen Kelly de Gronchi, and I'm excited to present the results of the systematic review on the relationship between the stakeholder involvement and mitigation behavior. We performed this review with support of my supervisors, Dr. Tanya Perko and Professor Dr. David Heavey. The objective of the review was to examine the relationship between the characteristics of stakeholders involved in communication interventions and the reported outcome of indoor radon testing and remediation. By stakeholders, we mean individuals or group who's responsible for or affected by indoor radon decisions and/or research. We look specifically at two stakeholder characteristics, which were level and type. On this slide, we'll go through level. We're referring to classifying stakeholders in terms of macro level, meso level, or micro level stakeholders. Macro level being national policy level stakeholders, for example, the European Union, and meso level community organizational, for example, local authorities or regional governments. Micro level being individual level homeowners and renters. If we take a look at communication intervention, we're defining this as a communication program or strategy, for example, a public health information campaign related to indoor radon. And there's three examples of which from three different countries on this slide here, from France, from Ireland, and from the United States. These are all indoor radon communication interventions from different stakeholders as well. So if you look to the right, you have a communication intervention from the Environmental Protection Agency of Ireland, the EPA, talking about how to test your home for radon, as well as what the risks related to radon. And then on the left, on the top left, kind of a similar communication intervention from France, also involving a map indicating different regions' risk level of indoor radon, and a more detailed map in the bottom left. And this was part of a new communication intervention in Kentucky in the United States, which is a high-risk region. And this was developed in conjunction with multiple stakeholders from the College of Nursing, the University of Kentucky, and the Geological Survey organization. So what you may notice is that you have different number of stakeholders involved and different types. Here in Ireland, an environmental organization, and then in Kentucky, you have academic and health and geology involved as well. So when we classify stakeholders by type, we're looking at those sort of elements. So why is this important to look at in terms of systematic review? And this because there has been a number of communication interventions, but there hasn't been constant or kind of sustainable success necessarily with achieving mitigation behavior, aka getting behavioral change of increasing radon testing and remediation, what you generally find is here on the display in the visual is that actually research indicated people are aware of radon, they can be aware of the risk, what it is. They're less kind of worried or care about the risks themselves. And then when you get to intent, do they intend to test the radon? Less people, do they even purchase a radon test? Even if they purchase a radon test, only a percentage of those may even perform the testing. And from testing, the individuals who have the high actionable results, how many of them remediate can be quite small. And it's not until you get to radon remediation do you achieve the kind of benefit of being able to prevent indoor radon. And that's ultimately where we want to get to with these communication interventions. So to address that objective and look at that, the elements of the stakeholder characteristics, we devised a systematic review. Here is the Prisma flowchart. We started with over 3,800 records in our search results through 16 databases. We ended up screening over 1,900 abstracts, reviewing about 100 full text records, and then including 34 studies in the final systematic review, which we extracted data from. Looking at some of the characteristics of those studies that were included in the systematic review, the time frame, they were published between 1989 and 2020, so one was actually quite recent. Behavior measured was primarily radon testing, so almost 75%, 74% measured radon testing, and less, 26%, looked at radon remediation. The exposure settings, looking where did the indoor radon testing behavior take place, was primarily, again, in residential. So 82% of the studies looked at residential indoor testing and remediation. The other exposure settings included public settings such as schools and childcare facilities and workplaces as well. In terms of the geographical location of the studies, they were actually quite broad in the abstracts, but ultimately the 34 studies that were included were from the United States, United Kingdom, Ireland, Canada, and Finland. And a lot of these programs have ongoing kind of long-term indoor radon communication interventions or programs. So perhaps this isn't too surprising in terms of the research. If we look at those 34 studies, the methodology involved with them, we found a couple of interesting things. We were looking at specifically for reported indoor radon testing and remediation data. So perhaps it's not surprising that 53% of the studies were quantitative and 41% were mixed. So ultimately over 90% had a quantitative element involved in the study. But out of that, only 4 studies reported controls and 12 studies reported baseline or pre-test reporting. And that, I think, is partially reflective of the study design of these 34 studies, where 68%, the majority, were case studies, but only 15% were quasi-experimental and 9% were experimental. And that kind of encumbered the ability to really analyze some of the data and to interpret the relationship between the intervention and the outcomes. So speaking of the data that we extracted to them and the outcomes, and going back to kind of the goal and objective of our systematic review, we extracted and classified stakeholder characteristics around type. And in the 34 studies, we found primarily, or the most common stakeholder type was around research and education, then health, then other, which was for stakeholder types we had not previously created a specific classification, an example of which was one study using supermarkets as a stakeholder, then federal, central government, local, regional government, nuclear safety, and mass media. Perhaps surprisingly, geology was only involved in one of the 34 studies that were included in our systematic review. And these studies could involve more than one stakeholder in their communication intervention. Taking a look at the other stakeholder characteristic level, here we have the percentage of study participants who completed indoor radon testing for where we had the data available from the studies, and classifying it according to meso, macro, meso, or macro only level stakeholders. You notice that on the right, the macro only level stakeholders, we only have 2 studies included in this visual, and that is reflective of the study design, which is mainly case studies, so we didn't have the information that we were able to report for this graph and systematic review. In terms of being able to glean some type of results from this data, it's high level. You can tell with the meso that there is a wide range of reported indoor radon testing outcomes. We're looking at nearly 1% all the way up to almost 80%. So it's a very complex, perhaps, intervention. And when you look at the macro and meso level, and also the macro only, there are indicators that involving the macro level stakeholder may increase indoor radon testing effectiveness, but that looking at the number of studies that we have and the quality of data is probably too premature to completely comment on that at this time. So if we look at the conclusions, looking at methods, and a lot of discussion around methods for the session, we take away that study design is very important. And the study design can help address some of these other issues, such as needing more quantitative data, and that's to be able to determine the effectiveness or the effect of the intervention on indoor radon testing rates and remediation. And if we have more experimental, quasi-experimental studies, hopefully we'll have more baseline testing and controls. Will help give us information about the effect of the intervention and what we specifically could be related to the intervention versus just general public indoor radon testing behavior rates. And also in terms of needing more data, few studies looked at radon remediation, but as mentioned, this is very important in terms of the preventative health behavior. So having more information about how many people ultimately who we're targeting remediated, I think is very important for future research and developing communication interventions. And lastly, around stakeholder characteristics, I kind of touched on this a little bit on the last slide. There's a wide range of effectiveness across stakeholder characteristics. The most common stakeholder level was meso only level, which had, as you saw, a very wide range of percentage of participants who tested for indoor radon outcomes. And there is possible indicators that macro level stakeholders may have a positive relationship to intervention effectiveness. So it'd be great to have more studies around the experimental and quasi-experimental, and to investigate this more with more studies as well and research to see if this could be a facilitator on the stakeholder level of increasing indoor radon testing and remediation. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. It's really amazing. Just before your presentation, we were able to listen to Sophie's presentation. She investigated mass media communication, and you investigated interventions with the stakeholders. But so interventions, they are not only communication, but they could be also something else. It could be legislation, it could be penalties, if you don't do something, and it could be recommendation by the World Health Organization or national authorities. But the results are similar. Again, so you and Sophie, both of you, you found that the design of the interventions or communication campaign fails in a lot of countries. You found only few nice examples where it was pre-test and test and evaluation and so on. So we call out now from this corner of this webinar to all decision makers, when you are contracting the consultancies or institutions to conduct the public awareness campaign or communication campaigns, please be attentive to the study design. But let's go back to your presentation, Sophie. You are saying stakeholders are important. Also, the previous European projects Engage showed that stakeholders, they are also decision makers, even if it's only the family. They make their own decisions how to protect from the radon, and to prevent to get lung cancer in the family. But which stakeholders, according to your opinion, Christine, are the one that we should really focus on? Do you have any idea? Did you get anything more substantial out from this evaluation of these studies, or just assumption?
I think, and kind of touching on, I know I mentioned in the last two slides about the macro level stakeholders, and I think there's definitely, I would like to see more opportunities for research and the study design being around experimental and quasi-experimental with these macro level stakeholders. They have very large samples in their reports. And I think there are some indications, say, for example, with nuclear safety or governments in some regions, that perhaps if the message is coming from the macro level stakeholder and from one that they trust or has credibility in that area around indoor radon, there's an opportunity to get people to act. Just touching on that quite quickly, you know, who's an important stakeholder in one country and trusted in radon could be different in another country. So I think that also demonstrates why it's important to not just look at one country, but to have lots of more research is better, and to look across Europe so that we can see the commonalities, but also kind of focus on the differences and compare them. And the methodology is going to let us do that if we have the right data.
Thank you. It's also another good news, which I can take out from the evaluation of the national radon action plans that they are now established in European member states. I noticed that in Germany, they are speaking about the multipliers. And also in Austrian radon action plan, I see that they are speaking about multipliers. And this is, they identified the group of stakeholders that they can help to improve the protection against the radon exposure to radon. So this is the way forward, definitely, and we are looking forward to the future results of your research, Christine, in your PhD. And I think that the authorities in Europe, they will be really grateful to get empirical evidence also from your PhDs to improve their instructions to the society how to protect against the radon. Good luck. And now we go to the next presentation from Dr. Evgenia Tomkiv from Norwegian University of Life Sciences.
Sorry, can Eugenia share the presentation herself? We seem to have a problem with exceeding the format of the file. Sorry, Eugenia.
Just give me a couple of seconds to find the video.
Okay.
Tanya, maybe you can fill the awkward silence with more of your comments about the research that needs to be done.
So Eugenia, she's our expert in stakeholder engagement, and she's also going to give a keynote speech at the next Norm 10 conference on the session on stakeholder engagement. So now you will be able to listen a bit about it, but then invited to the Norm 10 conference next year in conjunction with the RICOMET, where Eugenia will be a keynote speaker as well. And yes, Eugenia, she contributes also to the radon project, and she's the main author of she's the first author of this great deliverable, which you can find on the internet page of the radon. And in this deliverable, it's, I don't know, I think 300 pages and so on. You can get all this information that we are presenting today. So Eugenia, did you find already?
Yes, I found the file. Now I just need to remember what Mary told me about how to properly share it.
Okay, you go to share screen, advanced video, and share. Oh, all right. Yes, I see this.
Good. I think that it will come now.
I'm sorry, it doesn't allow me. It also says the resolution is.
Okay, maybe.
Could we move on to Deborah's and then
yes.
I'll yeah.
Yes, I suggest that we go to the next presentation, and meanwhile we will enable Eugenia's presentation. The next presentation is from Professor Deborah Otton, also from Norwegian University of Life Sciences. She's very well known in the ethics network. She will give a presentation about ethical challenges in social science research related to radon and norm. So Mary, if you can, thank you.
Hello, it's a pleasure to give you a very brief introduction to some of the work we've been doing on ethical challenges in social science research related to radon and norm. So to start off, a little bit of background, and there's a recognition that there has obviously been an evolution of ethical guidelines over the times. And that includes in all areas of research, not just in social science. But like very many developments in research ethics, things actually started off with the development of guidelines in medical ethics. For example, one of the first ethical guidelines in medicine in Western ethics being the Hippocratic Oath, and that eventually being formalized into the Helsinki Declaration, which was a consequence actually of the Nuremberg trials after Nazi atrocities, and first published in 1964, but being revived and new versions of the Helsinki Declaration coming out constantly over the years, about every 5 to 6 years, new versions of the Declaration, reflecting new challenges and the need for new guidelines and revision of those guidelines. And another area is that these guidelines have now gone from medicine to other areas, but along with that has seen a broader understanding of actually what we mean by harm, what we mean by the way in which we can impact on the entities, the people and the animals that we're doing research on, and particularly in the area of research involving humans, that it's gone from that you shouldn't come harming of your physiological state to actually hurt people, to understanding of the harm can be much more than that. We can talk about psychological harm, we can talk about stress, we can talk about infringements of privacy and human dignity as well, without having to actually call that physiological harm. That's been one of the big changes we've seen in the more recent years. Some key guidelines are by no means the first. The All European Academies presented a code of conduct first in 2011, and that was revised in 2017. It's actually undergoing ongoing revision at the moment, and this is a European code of conduct for research that has been broadly accepted, particularly in the area of EU research projects. And recognizing that there's a need not just for a broad ethical guideline in all areas of research, but different areas of research have different challenges, there was the production of particular guidelines for ethics in social science and humanities that was stimulated by the European Commission in 2018. Again, they're not the only ones that are looking at these areas, but they're two important guidelines that we need to be respectful of when we're doing research in radon norm. So what do the current guidelines actually say? Their core principles are actually rather similar. For example, in ELIA, there's a focus on the need for reliability, honesty, and respect and accountability. So reliability in the way one designs and carries out research, quality of the research, honesty in the way in which the research is presented and communicated, respect for both the people and the entities one's carrying out research on, and the colleagues and the broader members of society, and then accountability for the possible consequences of research to, again, through the whole of the research project, including outcomes and consequences for society. So in the societal ethics document, they have an important distinction between the procedural ethics, which is the need to respect internal ethical protocols and demonstrate that those have been respected, and then more general challenges that may come from ethics in practice, meaning the ethical challenges you have in actually carrying out research. So they quote this statement that researchers have this overriding obligation to protect participants' welfare and safety, and to ensure that they're treated fairly and with respect. And throughout both of these guidelines, you see, for example, underlining the need to be respectful of dignity and integrity of participants, the need for privacy, the need for participants to be giving consent to research, the increased focus on being very, very careful with vulnerable research populations, and the overall justification of the research that's being carried out. And in the social ethics guideline, there's also recognition of the data privacy and protection issues and the need for good data management that comes up from GDPR, which was published in 2016. I'll come back to that later. So as a start, we had a look, and this was part of a much bigger investigation under the radon norm project, and it was looking at a systematic literature review to see what had actually been carried out in the areas of social science in norm and radon. And as a little part of that, we were also looking into the way in which the published papers had actually dealt with ethical issues in the research they were carrying out, what issues we were reporting, and then concluding with some emerging issues for new things we could think were likely to become an issue in the future, and also for the research carried out in radon norm. So the actual procedure of that literature review is very nicely presented in the radon norm deliverable on the study that was carried out, but very briefly, and really not surprisingly, what we do see is that there has been, thankfully, and it's good to see that, an increase in the number of papers that actually do report ethical issues, and specifically that they have applied for ethical approval and ethical guidelines. But at the same time, over the years, there's only been 35 of those 142 papers that had any explicit mention of ethical issues. Now, it doesn't mean they haven't addressed them. They could have had these applications for ethical approval, but they have not actually explicitly stated that in the paper. But anyway, we are seeing an increase in the number of publications that are dealing with ethical issues. But what kind of issues do they deal with? Of course, there's how they've got ethical approval, and we can see differences here from local approval, a local university, for example, to turning to more sort of national ethical committees when those are available for giving approval for research that's been carried out. Very rarely is there any mention of any kind of interaction with investigated communities. Only 2 of the papers actually mentioned that they had discussed ethical issues with the communities that were being investigated. And a few of them actually stated that there was no need to get consent. And for example, here, in this case, because no personal identifying information was collected during the study, and that would be seen to be possibly not sufficient reasons for not needing to apply for consent of participants in current research ethics guidelines. Interesting other issues. Some people pointed out that the ethical considerations had prevented sending brochures, the way they were interacting with the participants. And this is something that I think we need to have a much more deeper focus and reflection on in the research that's being carried out. What are the consequences of the way in which we're interacting with participants? So this, the sort of low-tech brochures, so that we're wanting to test the way in which communication information will be picked up by participants, and on the other side, that the limited the differences that could be created to trying to get differences in response to high and low exposure situations would seem to be possibly manipulating in problematic ways the people that were participating in the study. And these are very, very important issues to look at. And we can see those also in the emerging issues that we were looking at, the new ethical requirements, particularly in the area of data protection and privacy, and potential conflicts of interest between the researchers and the things they're studying, implications of radon measurements. This goes much, much broader than the social science issues, implications that those measurements or any kind of study may have on privacy, house prices, health insurance, participants' concern about their own health or their children's health and status. This need to balance between open science and sharing data, and on the other side, the privacy and anonymity of participants can cause them issues. There's a much more increased focus on citizen science studies and the ethical aspects of those, particularly, for example, privacy, transparency, equality, the quality of the data, and the equity in terms of recognition of the way in which the studies are being carried out, and inclusiveness, how we actually manage to include citizens in a correct way in these kinds of studies. And another issue is changes in way the research data can be used, because you can collect research data in one study and I found that this is really valuable, but you haven't got consent to the use of that data in other areas that go beyond how you planned your research to be carried out. So just to finish off on a couple of these, a little bit more detail, the general data protection regulation. What this actually says, it's regulation on the protection of natural persons with regard to the processing of personal data and on the free movement of such data. And very, very shortly, that means at a bare minimum, any studies carried out on radon and norm, including participants, you will have to really give strong information on the way in which their data will be stored, how it will be used, how and when it will eventually be destroyed. Now, that was an intention to promote open science and transparency across a whole load of different areas of research, not just social science and not just research into radon and norm, but actually it is having some discussions about the actual consequence of GDPR in many areas of research, and a concern that although the intention was to actually promote open science and transparency at the same way of protecting the people that were involved in research, that there's a concern that that's actually doing the opposite, and it's causing people to not share data because of problems with the privacy of participants. Objectivity and bias, this is picking up on some of those things on the broader consequences of the research and the broader obligations of the researchers that are carrying out social science. Because we want to be objective, we don't want to be influencing the response of participants that we are studying on their concerns and needs or reflections on radon and norm. But at the same time, there are possibly some obligations in how we deal with those obligations or the possibilities that they may induce bias. For example, should one criticize poor building construction when you're seeing that that might be causing elevated radon exposure? Radon spas are a really interesting case because there's a lot of interactions that you could have if you're doing research on perceptions of radon spa visitors. Is the obligation to inform them if you see they're being misinformed on health risks or misinformed on exposures? Or is the research in itself likely to indirectly give a positive view of health spas and their possible health benefits. And underlying all this, of course, that a lot of the people using the health spas may have very serious underlying medical conditions. So there are some discussions there that I think is important to reflect on. And of course, broader as well in terms of sustainability, that industries using norm or causing increased concentrations of norm concentrations, that may be just one dimension of the potential environmental and health risks of industry, and is it important for researchers to, or should they not bring up these kind of discussions? So I have some take-home messages for challenges. I think there will be a new focus on, there are new requirements in terms of data protection and to be privacy, and to be much more focused on potential conflicts of interest, this balance between open science and privacy, citizen science and ethical aspects of those kind of studies, and to recognize and have a deeper ethical reflection over the broader dilemmas and responsibilities of researchers. So thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. It's a really fantastic overview about the difficulties that researchers we are exposed nowadays in our investigation of radon and norm. What is not mentioned at your presentation, but I personally had the problems, is also the protecting my ethical responsibility, I think, to protect also the name of the polluter on investigated site, because it had also economic consequences. At the moment that we started to investigate one polluted site, the polluter was known and the stocks failed of the went out. So it's a really difficult openness, transparency, research practices, and so on, really difficult to fulfill every expectations. But you are now also the member of the ethical board of the radon project. So now in the new times, we have the ethical body who advises the researchers on these ethical difficulties that we are exposed to. Can you tell me what are the problems that you see now, or challenges when you are consulted by the researchers in the radon?
In radon, I mean, I'm very, it's not just me, there's a team of us, Gaston and Beham Tabe as well, who are involved in that. I mean, it's ranging from everything for just giving approval for protocols and being able to comment on the way in which the protocols are designed and inform consent, for example. We see it varies from nation to nation. For example, in Norway, we're very, very strict now on any kind of study that you ask anything or collect any kind of personal data, then that actually has to be registered. It's slightly different from getting actually approval for the study, but the study has to be registered with a central authority. But I think the real challenges are actually stimulating more broader ethical reflection of the things like you were talking about. What are the consequences of this study going to be, not just on the people participating, but like you said, also the industries themselves, the authorities. So I think what we're really hoping to do in Radon is to have to assign time for those kind of reflections on the studies.
Thank you, Eugenia. Thank you, Deborah. See you next time. And Eugenia, you are ready to do your presentation live. Is it true?
Yes, I am ready.
You're great.
I am very into improvising, so I am just going to present this.
Thank you so much.
Hopefully as well as it was on the video. So yes, as I mean, Tanya has already given me so much really kind presentation, so I don't really need to explain who I am. But I'm here today to present to you some preliminary results from a study where we looked at the behavioral components, interventions, and policies, and what has actually been investigated related to these three topics in the context of radon research. And the reason we performed this study was actually, you know, it's again our attempt to fill this value action gap of, you know, how can we go from, you know, people knowing about radon and perceiving it as a risk to actually motivate them to do some behavioral change. So this study is just yet another bit of puzzle that can help us understand how to solve this issue. So what we see from the current situation in the different countries is that we really need to design and implement successful behavioral change interventions and policies, and we also need to base them on solid evidence, as Melissa have clearly explained to us earlier today. So with this study, what we wanted to do is just to map out to see, where do the studies have been done so far fit in terms of, what kind of behavioral components, interventions, and policies have been investigated. And we have chosen behavioral change wheel, as the framework for our analysis. And the reason for that is that this framework was actually developed by Michi et al. To help characterize the interventions and link them to the analysis of the target behaviors. So the authors of this framework, they attempted to link together all the different, all the three behavioral components, so capability, opportunity, and motivation. Then you can see on the image, these components are encircled with the 9 different interventions, so types of interventions, and then with the 7 types of policies that could support, in the implementation of these interventions. So we thought that this was quite a overarching complete framework, which we thought would be interesting to use for our analysis. And then we tried to sort of map out the studies that we found about the radon onto this wheel, just to say it that way. You have heard, I think, enough about the way we performed the systematic literature review today, so I'm not going to focus a lot on that. We have done a big sampling with the radon and using the radon and methodology, social science methodology keywords to get the widest range possible, the broadest variety of the social science studies. We went through several circles of evaluation and the exclusion of the studies to end up with the sample of 155 papers that we actually included in this review and analyzed further. So in order to help us analyze the papers, we actually had to link the behavioral change wheel with some, with the radon relevant examples. So this is what we did for all three topics. We have used the definitions that are provided within the behavioral change wheel framework, and then we just added what it would mean in terms of the radon related research and radon related variables. So for instance, capability, behavioral component capability, it relates to variables like knowledge and awareness, confidence and own knowledge, while motivation is related to things like perception, threat perception, susceptibility, emotional response, and similar variables. While the opportunity is the kind of behavioral component that focuses more on the kind of external things that can influence an individual in their decision to change their behavior. So, for instance, community engagement and financial resources, and perceived ease of remediation, and similar aspects. So we've done the same for the interventions and policies. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I hate having tables in the presentations. I'm sorry for that, but this is just to show you how we processed with our analysis. So for instance, one of the interventions could be coercion, and then in a radon context, that could mean fining people for not remediating. I'm not sure anybody is doing that yet, but this could be, for instance, one of the interventions. And then for policies, again, for instance, a fiscal type of policy could be giving tax deductions for those that have remediated or have tested. So these are the types of examples we looked, and then once we analyzed, we could use this. We could use this sort of extension of explanation of the framework to aid us with categorizing the papers. So once we had all of these explanations ready, we created a beautiful Excel sheet. And we have had 2 coders go through every single paper, read through every single paper, and categorize where that paper fit within these 3 different topics. So behavioral components, interventions, and policies. Now, enough about the analysis and a little bit about the results. And you can see here that clearly the motivation aspect of the behavior was the most studied topic in the papers that we reviewed. This is just to remind you, these are the risk perception studies, the emotional response studies. This is the type that fits into the motivational component. These studies were closely followed by those that focused on capabilities, so people's knowledge and awareness. But you can see also that the external factors that contribute to the decision making, they have been understudied. So there are not as many papers that actually look at that type of behavioral component. Moreover, only 16% of the papers in our sample actually looked at 3 of these components together, which is quite a striking result. That this is, you know, that most of the papers have actually just picked 1 or 2, but never addressed the behavior in its complexity. We have also like separately scored whether behavior was actually used as a dependent variable. So whether they actually whether people actually studied how whatever each one of these aspects or them together influence the behavior. And it's only in 1/5 of the papers that it was actually a dependent variable and not you know, just and the papers didn't just look simply at what people knew without having it, studying it as an impact factor. So with regard to the interventions, we can see that less than half of the studies included some kind of intervention component in them. And just to remind you that a study could have several of the interventions in it. So the percentages don't actually add up because they're not, the interventions are not mutually exclusive. Therefore, you can see that perhaps you'd question why they have less than half. We can see that the most common intervention is still focused on education. And so, you know, it could be testing different brochures and the way they impacted on, you know, on people's knowledge or people's perceptions. The second most common intervention was enablement, and what we put in this and what was commonly sorted into this category was the provision of the tests, for instance, or provision of the so giving people the tests that they can actually measure radon in their homes. Similarly with policies, it's even it's even less of the papers that had a policy component involved, and the most not surprisingly, the most common policy component was related to communication and marketing, which means often various types of the communication campaigns or awareness raising campaigns. But also a couple of papers we can see that have addressed service provision on the policy level, also actually putting some kind of services for testing and remediation, making them available for people. So as you can see, I mean, these are the preliminary results, but we can already say something about how behavior components and interventions and policies were studied in the radon research. It's quite surprising how few studies actually address behavior as a complex, and that is really a pity because we know behavior is super complicated, and in order to actually achieve a behavioral change, there's so many different factors that are in play. So it's really unfortunate that so few studies will actually address all of these factors. There are also very few studies that test interventions, interventions and policies. And there are probably lots of reasons for that, but again, it means that in the scientific literature we have very little evidence on what kind of things work and which things don't. So what strategies actually work, and what can we recommend that can be used in different countries to achieve behavioral change. And also the most commonly used interventions and policies are still often focused on education and communication marketing. And I know several scholars have raised this in the literature, have raised a big question around whether these are the most effective policies at all, because we know that just by focusing on awareness raising, you cannot really achieve the behavioral change. So just to conclude from all of this, I think we really need to, step up the game and start addressing behavioral, focus on all the behavioral components and addressing behavior in as such a complex complex concept as it is. And we really need to put some effort into testing the effects of different interventions and policies. So perhaps we can get, inspired by by other health communication spheres, because this health communication is being done in so many different topics. Perhaps there are different interventions and policies that can work much better than the usual communication campaigns that we all know about. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very sorry for the technical issues.
Thank you, Eugenia. You again proved how great communicator you are, not only researcher, but also communicator. I hope that you will understand that we will now not pose you any question, but we will make a really short break, 5 minutes, and then we will resume together with the panelists who they will reflect all presentations together and also enlighten the research and methods applied in the radon and norm from their own field. So let's make a break, and we really short break, and we come together 10 minutes to 11. Hope to see you back. Hello, everybody. I hope that everybody is back, that you are still fresh enough to the second part of our webinar. I have really great, I'm host of really great panelists today. With me are Professor Dr. David Havey, Head of School of Psychology from Trinity College Dublin, the University of Dublin in Ireland. Then we have with us also Professor Emeritus Neil Weinstein, retired from Rutgers University in United States. It's in the middle of the night, Professor. I'm really sorry for this, but since you came out from all these systematic reviews as the most influential and the most professor with the most sound methods in the radon, we really insisted to have you here and to keep you awake during the night now in the United States. And with us, we also have Dr. Boris de Hanshutter from Federal Agency for Nuclear Control. He is also a member of the management board of the European Radon Association. And we are really happy, Boris, that you're also here, and you will enlighten us a bit also from the regular point of view, where we are and where do we go in the radon and norm research. I would like first to ask you, the three panelists, what is your reflection on this presentation? What is the thing that struck you, or maybe you already knew about it and you would like to pinpoint it out once more? I will give first the floor to Professor Neil Weinstein.
Shall I say good morning or good night? It's 2 o'clock in the morning here. I was very impressed by first the huge amount of work that went into all of these reviews. I know how time-consuming it is, but I'm equally impressed by the care and thought that went into identifying the constructs and the situations and the processes that can potentially affect radon testing and mitigation. Identifying those constructs are very important to making any progress. Despite the large number of studies that were reviewed, I think it's clear that it's very difficult to draw conclusions about what motivates, what is effective in changing radon behavior. And one of the main reasons, as has been mentioned by several presenters, is that often the research studies have serious methodological weaknesses, lack of control groups, poorly designed interventions, if there is an intervention, and unreliable measurements. And given that radon attracts people from many different disciplines, that's not surprising. In addition to social scientists, there are people interested in radon from radiation safety, public health, communications, construction, law. So it's not surprising that they have very different training and might not have the same kind of methodological rigor that social scientists are trained to employ. So my overall one overall conclusion is that, which is often true, is that you can have a very large body of research and not gain a great deal of knowledge from it. And so I hope one of the things that we can help do in this webinar is to provide some guidance on how to make that research more productive.
Thank you. David, probably you, Professor David Havey, probably you agree with Professor Weinstein, but is there something else that for you was even more significant or striking?
Yeah, I fully agree with what Professor Weinstein has noted. I think the other piece that struck me was really the absence of clear causal thinking around the conceptualization. So it's very obvious that a lot of the efforts are still targeting things like knowledge and awareness, but not taking a more sophisticated look at what the determinants are of these behaviors. So I think there's a methodological issue, but I think there's also at times a conceptual issue, how people are trying to understand what it is they're trying to change. And I think Yevgenia's presentation, I think, really brought home some of the gaps in what we're not doing.
Thank you, David. And Dr. Boris de Hanshutter, you are not social scientist, but you are also decision maker and strong opinion maker in this field. What is for you, was there something new for you in these presentations?
Well, yes, thank you. I think from my point of view, as coordinating also the Belgian National Radon Action Plan, in which radon communication, surveys, measurement campaigns, and so on take an important part. All 6 very interesting presentations, I think, pointed out and highlighted again the importance of evaluating and studying the impact of the different activities we conduct in the field of communication and measuring and so on. So the aspects of the behavioral components that are present in every activity that is carried out and that can be studied and analyzed afterwards to evaluate the particular study investigated is very important, I think, and it was very well shown by the presentations from Melissa and Yevgenia also, that so the behavioral components like capability, motivation, and opportunity to study this in detail is possible, and is very important to adjust and to improve the way we communicate and the way we perform surveys and campaigns. That's all. So that was
Boris, but actually we cannot blame the national authorities for this failure in the campaigns up till now, because also in legislation is required only to increase the awareness. In Annex 18 of new basic safety standards, the countries, member states, they are required to increase the awareness, but not to change the behavior or to go much broader. Is there something still that we can do on this, or we should take the basic safety standards at some minimum, let's say?
Yes, it is by definition a minimum, but it's also a condition that needs to be fulfilled. You need to have the awareness before you can go further. So increasing awareness is the first step in the process of maybe getting to a behavioral change. But the final objective of the whole idea of having a radon action plan and policy around radon, controlling radon indoors, here we're talking about the general public. So this is one aspect of the radon management. But the general idea is to decrease the exposures. So it has to lead to some behavioral change on an individual level, but also on a local policy level, legislation about building conditions and building requirements and so on. So this awareness is a part of a long process in the first step.
But it's I mean, and with the final goal to reduce the lung cancer due to the radon. And here I would like to go back to Professor Neil Weinstein. It's quite some decades ago when you started with your radon-related research, and since you got retired, we see also gap in the scientific publications in the worldwide. Could you maybe tell me, how did you get interested in radon research, and were there any barriers at first facing a social scientist who wanted to study radon back then? And of course, are there research designs you used still feasible today?
Those are some big questions. Let me tell you about how I first became involved. I consider myself a research psychologist, but my doctorate is in chemical physics. And near the end of my doctoral training, I realized I didn't want to continue in that field and wanted to change into psychology. And I very hesitantly talked to my doctoral advisor, being worried that he would be upset that he had spent 5+ years working with me, and then I was leaving the field. But instead of being angry, what he said to me was, "You're very brave. That psychology and human beings are so much more complicated than molecules and atoms. We can change just the pressure or the temperature, the concentration, but people are influenced by so many variables." And I took that to heart. And so when I was a professor and trying to decide how I should approach the study of risk behavior, I was looking for something to study that wasn't too complicated. So studying smoking, I didn't want to consider, because we know that stopping smoking is so difficult that that would be a very major factor in whether people quit smoking or not. And studying diet or exercise, both of those are complicated behaviors with many determinants. So I think my decision to look at radon was a methodological one, that this seemed to be a pretty clear-cut behavior. It could be done fairly discrete in time and not terribly difficult, so that the issues determining it would be not so much carrying out the behavior as getting people to undertake the behavior in the first place. So actually, that is how I began to study, how I chose to study radon. And I approached the state environmental agency to get support for doing research, because an area of my state, New Jersey, had very high levels of naturally occurring radon.
So you approached them?
I approached them.
Okay.
And they stalled and didn't want to talk about it. And the reason was that their experience was with a radon in a different situation that was entirely different response. They had experience with the disposal of waste from a radium watch dial factory. That's where the time on the watch dial was painted with radium containing paint. And the state wanted to dispose of this material in an abandoned quarry. And the public around who lived in that area was so outraged, they threatened to station people with rifles and shoot any trucks that tried to come to deliver the radon. So at the very beginning of the radon issue, the state was worried that the problem would be overreaction, and they didn't want to stir up anything. So it took a while before they realized that that wasn't the situation. But it's also good lesson in how situational factors can lead to such dramatic differences in how people respond to risks. And maybe I've gone on long enough. I want to make sure other presenters have an opportunity. So I'll pass on.
Just maybe if you can still list really few things that about the research designs are still used, the one that you used still feasible today or not? What you saw, for instance, also from the presentation from Debra Otten, we are in different contexts today that you used to be.
Right. I was able to call people at their homes, recruit them to be in a study, have them watch a videotape that I sent to them and give me a feedback with a questionnaire. I think we had 3 contacts with each person. But now I know, because I've been involved in some political campaigns, at least in this country, people don't even answer the phone. If they don't recognize your phone number, you won't get through. So it's an entirely different world now, and I don't have any answers. I guess I feel lucky that at the time I was actively engaged in research.
We feel lucky also that we have your results available.
Well, I'm glad I did get some results.
Yes.
So really that's the huge difference I see, that just calling people up and talking to them is no longer, at least in this country, a feasible research approach. It's the sample you would get would be highly biased.
With this input, with your research, we are still nowadays, we have the most of knowledge from your research in the field of societal aspects of radon. So thank you for this. But David, can you tell me why the social science methods are so important? Is it such a big fuss about these methods? Does it deserve?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to echo something that Professor Weinstein mentioned, I mean, I'm always drawn to the quote from the great sociobiologist Edward Wilson when he talks about the social sciences as being hyper complex and inherently more difficult than physics and chemistry. And as a result, it's the social sciences that should be called the hard sciences. And I think quite often social sciences are labeled as being the soft sciences. Yet I think what all of the presentations this morning have shown is this idea that the rigor and the quality of the methods we use in the social sciences are going to a large extent determine the strength of conclusions we can draw. So the social sciences address core social problems. We identify really challenging questions in the context of the most complex, contradictory creatures known, i.e. people. So we have to try and understand those people in various contexts, community norms, societal norms. And therefore, that puts a lot of pressure on our methods to be as rigorous as they can. And I think we're lucky in the social sciences, right? We have an entire discipline of psychometrics that focuses on how we measure these constructs, these kind of perceptions we have. We have an implementation science that tells us how we should go about developing our interventions, how we monitor them, how we check fidelity. So we have lots of good evidence to help guide us in doing this. The challenge we have in the social sciences is how we communicate these methods and processes to our colleagues, because I think, as has been noted, radon has an interdisciplinary focus, which means that quite often people are coming to examine questions of behavior and behavior change without necessarily having been exposed to kind of the best quality methods that exist within the social sciences. So I think social sciences have so much to offer, but I think we in the social sciences probably have a bit of work to do to sell ourselves and to make people aware of the strength of the methods that we have. And maybe we all need to have the courage, like Professor Weinstein had, to go and tell these agencies that we have important insights and approaches that can help them understand the kind of critical questions they're trying to address.
Thank you. So Boris, this is actually now one proposal from David. Tomorrow we come on your door and we knock and we say we deserve more. No, this is a joke. But if you look into the chat area, for instance, the comment from Ivica Perlic, he said that the government in Croatia, for instance, or maybe also our other governments, they say that increasing awareness or communication campaign are too expensive. And the first thing that the researchers they have to do is to fight for the budget. So I personally, I'm afraid that because the governments don't invest in the good, sound interventions, then they invest in something that is just something like questionnaires that they are not validated, that campaigns that they are not pre-tested and tested and evaluated and so on. It's actually losing the money. But how, Boris, what do you think, how social scientists can actually help authorities to improve the radon mitigation and consequently reduce the lung cancer?
Well, I can tell you from our experience, it is very important to evaluate and to study the impact of an intervention, of a communication campaign, of any kind of campaign. And this is very challenging. It's very difficult, and it needs the involvement of social scientists to do it properly and to do it how to say, on a scientific sound level. Let me give you an example of, for example, every year we do a measurement campaign nationwide where we provide radon detectors to the general population, and we communicate about the campaign, and we try to motivate people to measure and to mitigate. After every campaign, we have a number of tests, tests that people made at their homes, and it varies from year to year. So we try to assess the reason why. And we see it depends enormously and mostly because the methodology is every year the same. So we can study the influencing factors, and it depends mostly on the conditions, and it depends on the context of the specific year. For example, we have several hundreds of tests made on average in a certain region. And a specific year, there was a publication of a person who had lung cancer and had never smoked. And she published in a newspaper an article about her condition and how it was strange that she developed lung cancer. And then she mentioned this measurement campaign in the article. And afterwards, we got 3 times or 4 times more requests from people to measure radon because they just read it in a newspaper as testimony from a real person. So it was driven purely by emotions and by something that is irrational by definition, and so very difficult to predict and to control. So this is one example of how difficult it is for us to evaluate and to assess the impact of communication campaigns.
So it's my next question would be, what is needed to improve our understanding of how encourage testing and mitigation behavior? But you already said personal testimonies, according to your opinion, according to your experiences, they resulted really as influential. Is there something else that you feel that it would help, especially mitigation? Because like you said, testing is done, let's say, to some amount, but still we see the reduction from those tests that they are positive, the houses are still not remediated. So what is your feeling? What is your assumption? What else could help?
First of all, I think the opportunities have to be there. So we have to stimulate and facilitate the conditions. So that means in practice, we need the market. We need mitigators that can offer solutions to the people on different levels. So people must be able to make a choice. Okay, I choose this mitigator because he's cheaper, or so the market has to be there and the conditions, and this is, I think, the most important, and it also can be from a social scientist point of view, it can be important to study this in more detail, and how to create these conditions, how to stimulate them, how to facilitate it.
There is something else what came out from the recent study here in Belgium, but also from this literature review, is that one of the most important behavior component is whether people know to whom can they go to get an advice, which are the experts that they can remediate the house, how to mitigate, and so on. So this is also the information that it's lacking, and probably it's barrier in the behavior change. At least in Walloon region, high radon prone area in Belgium, this resulted is one of the most important behavior components. So maybe you can improve also maybe internet page from this point of view. I don't know, but there are some results that they could be used. But Professor Neil Weinstein, what according to you, what is needed to improve our understanding of how to encourage testing and especially mitigation behavior? Professor, you are muted. Could you unmute yourself?
I'd like to return to the question of awareness and knowledge in a couple of ways. Evgenia already mentioned the gap between awareness and behavior, and I want to just reinforce that there's many things that occur between knowing about something and carrying out a behavior. And in particular, I think in general, there's a very weak correlation between knowledge and action. And there are many kinds of knowledge that you might put in a radon knowledge test that would be pretty irrelevant to behavior. I did a lot of studies of what people know about the risks of smoking, and a question about what are the dangerous components in cigarette smoke. Knowledge about that, I'm sure, would be pretty irrelevant to whether people take action or not. So although awareness is, I believe, a prerequisite for action, substantial knowledge isn't. And if you're aware of the issue, and you see people around you and people you trust taking action, then more detailed knowledge probably is not necessary. And the conclusion is that we shouldn't spend most of our effort in increasing knowledge, because that probably isn't terribly important. And a second suggestion for more effective studies, and this relates to what Boris said, is that when we study a particular hazard that we're familiar with, I think we often underestimate how much knowledge is needed to carry out the behavior we want people to carry out, such as doing a radon test is probably the first science experiment that most people have done since they were in school. It takes detailed knowledge about the kinds of test kits, where to place them, how to get them, where to send them, what the results mean. So in terms of barriers to action, I think too often we underestimate the difficulty of carrying out the behavior. So that's a second area that I would want to encourage people to keep in mind as they design interventions.
Thank you. Professor David Havey, you are in one of the most radon-prone areas in Europe, in Ireland. I think that around 300 people per year lose their life due to the lung cancer, due to the radon. And EPA, this Environmental Protection Agency in Ireland, is one of the most developed agencies in the fighting against radon, and they really tried different communication campaigns, and they are really advanced, including citizen science in the radon field, not only for testing, but they are trying now also to mitigate. And you are collaborating with them, and you were one of the first social scientists invited by authorities to do a real in-depth study what influences people's behavior. And in this study, you identified 17 steps that each person needs to go through before actually test or mitigate the house. So what, according to your opinion or to your research, would still need to be done to improve the mitigation of the houses?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of when we break it down, and I think this is one thing that social scientists do very well, is we can break down the kind of steps behind behaviors. And again, going back to some of Professor Weinstein's work, I mean, it was very clear that the sorts of things you do to get people motivated are not the sorts of things you do to get people to actually do a behavior, right? And I think what that means is that in planning interventions, we have to look at it as being almost a complex series of mini interventions to help bring people along. And what we tend to do, unfortunately, is just have a kitchen sink approach where we throw lots of things in and hope that some of it will do something without actually going through the process of almost mapping back, well, what helps people, you know, kind of move through these stages to get to the point where they're actually going to remediate. And I think one of the issues, which I suppose Boris alluded to, was this idea of, I suppose, what motivates us. So all of the dry statistics and all of the percentages will generally be washed out in the face of one very compelling narrative. So that idea of appealing to emotions, that idea of appealing to personal experience, I think is critically important. So the more it can be humanized in terms of, here's the person who's lived with this, here's their regret, here's kind of how you can kind of avoid those mistakes. I think it's trying to give people the very clear action-oriented messages, but making the action as clear and as simple as possible. Because again, you know, one of the things that's come through the studies we've done has been almost a sense of distrust. So that when you get people coming saying you have a problem with radon, that's quite easily dismissed as being, oh, these are just people trying to get money from me, I don't need to do this. Because quite often the message comes from people that they're not aware of. Whereas if radon is a health issue, the people they trust over their health are their GPs, are the medics, but the medics aren't the people who are talking to them about radon. So again, there can be all of these challenges, and I think Kristen's talk alluded to this, over who is carrying the message. And again, where that needs to be kind of, I suppose, kind of supported is trying to think, if we're bringing people along all these different steps, we might need different message carriers at different points in this to make sure we get people there as effectively as possible. I think really what it brings home is this is really complex. And yet I think we've taken an overly simplistic approach in how we've tried to change but also to support people in essence, doing one thing, which is like screening for your health. And then the second thing is doing remediation to address a health concern. And we know from the literature on general health screening that even those people who are potentially most at risk from cancer can be very avoidant about attending screening. So there's all of these kind of defensive emotional processes that I'm not sure we've really come to grips with in terms of how we think about the health communication process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pity that we still need to assume the things that we don't have evidence in our hands. For this. However, we did one pilot study here in Belgium, and we also noticed from the empirical results and from the behavioral models that people would not remediate their house because they're afraid, because this is their home. It's not how we are speaking about homes, it's value. And they would not like to destroy their home. because of this. So this is also one aspect that needs much higher attention to be investigated and empirically proved. And also in Sweden, your assumption is set, okay, personal testimonies, they can confirm the things and they can drive people to change their behavior. Also, Boris pointed out that in Belgium, according to his opinion, this happened. In Sweden, they made a campaign. They videotaped the personal testimonies of people that are going through the cancer. But unfortunately, again, study design is not perfect because they don't have this basis where they started. And also, I didn't still see any evaluation of this campaign. So again, really pity that they didn't follow the real study design for this, that we also other countries could learn out of it. Now we have online also Miss Rebecca Coates. Rebecca, are you already here online? Rebecca is head of radon projects at Propet Eco in United Kingdom and chair of the UK Radon Association in United Kingdom. Are you there, Rebecca?
I am. Good morning, Tanya. Hi, everybody.
Yes. Hello. Good morning. Rebecca, can you give just your short feedback, your reflection on what is going on out in the practice related to the communication campaigns? You're also responsible for some communication campaigns. So tell us what is going on out.
So I'm not an academic. I'm not a researcher. I'm out in a company and with the UK Radon Association in the UK, speaking to members of the public, finding out what they know and trying to run campaigns to increase awareness and action in the UK. So there's a couple of examples I wanted to give of things that we've done that have been effective, and picks up on certainly some of the things that the panelists have just been discussing now in the last few minutes. So firstly, the language that's used to communicate the risks to people. We all talk about becquerels per cubic meter of air. And when someone receives a test result report saying you've got 500 becquerels, you should do something. Most people, they're not radiation experts or scientists. They don't know what becquerel is and what that's doing to them. An example, a colleague of mine went to visit a householder about something to do with this house that wasn't radon, a completely different issue that my colleague also had expertise in. And when he was there, my colleague said, oh, you're living in a high-risk radon area. Have you ever tested the house for radon? And he said, oh, yes, there was a campaign a few years ago. Our results were about 600 becquerels. So my colleague said, well, what did you do? And this chap said, well, we didn't do anything. The report just said it was higher than it should be, but we've lived here for a long time. Our health seems fine. My colleague said, well, do you realize you're getting a significant radiation dose? Around about the equivalent of a chest x-ray each every day for you and your wife in radiation dose whilst you're in the house. And you could see instantly this person went, really? If someone had explained that to me, that was the amount of radiation I was getting from something that I've just been breathing in the house, then I would have taken action. And he did. He then mitigated his house because the risk had been explained to him in something that he could understand, not just in text on a piece of paper, not something that was talking about a unit of radiation that most non-scientists don't understand. So I think the language that we use and explaining the risks in terms that people can relate to and something that they can think, I wouldn't want that to be happening to me. If I understood it like that, then that can drive mitigation. And I think that's a really important thing where we've been discussing. It's not just the awareness and the testing, it's then the taking the action to mitigate. The other thing I wanted to mention was, as I think David was just saying, who's giving the message and how do people receive that message differently depending on who's saying it. So for years in the UK, Public Health England have been putting out material, running campaigns about radon. Us as the UK Radon Association, we have an annual Radon Awareness Week, which we started about 5 years ago, having visited the US and seen in North America the types of awareness campaigns that they're running, trying to use more mainstream media and particularly trying to use celebrities or familiar faces that people, general members of the public, are familiar with, not someone from a scientific government body giving this message, someone that they have seen in their favorite TV show or that they've heard on the radio. So a couple of years ago, we engaged a celebrity in the UK who does programs about how to do up your house and how to make your house worthwhile money. Does all sorts of property shows, and he was happy to be involved. He also was living in a radon affected area, so we said, we'll test your house and you can talk about your experience of testing your house. So he did that. He then was interviewed on BBC radio, primetime radio, and the lunchtime slot. And the impact of that was that the Public Health England website crashed. It had the highest numbers of visitors it had ever had over that period of time, that lunchtime, because so many people had heard about radon and then decided they wanted to check their postcode to check whether they were living in a radon affected area. I don't have access to the information on how many test kits were then ordered, how many people then went on to actually test, find they had high levels and mitigate. But that did generate a lot of interest and certainly initial action that otherwise a lot of those people would still never have heard about radon. So I do think it's a case of getting radon more into the mainstream media so it becomes something that people are familiar with and it's normal to talk about, not some niche thing that only radiation scientists talk about, or you have to go onto a government website to find out about. If we've got celebrities, influencers on social media talking about it, I think then it reaches an audience rather than expecting people to go looking for the information from a specific source.
You still have
no, that was the couple of points that I wanted to
fantastic. But Rebecca, do you have you're a practitioner in the field of communication and you are doing you're trying this and that, what it will work better and so on. Which steps could be taken at organizational level to improve research to support you, that you would not try? Because this I mean, trial fail, okay, and try succeed, but you don't know why exactly. So according to your opinion, you're also UK Radon Association representative, which institutional and organizational steps could be taken that research would be more supported, and through this also research results would support your practical problems solution?
So I think we need to have some way of tracking action from after a campaign, how many people have tested, and then how many of those people have gone on to mitigate. The trouble with that we find is that there's a wide variety of sources now where people can test. So they can buy tests through the government agency, they can buy tests from private laboratories, companies like ours, or there's now a lot of digital electronic monitors that people can pick up on Amazon. So it's very hard to actually ascertain how many people have taken that action. The ultimate goal, though, of all of this is to get people to remediate. So I would think potentially, rather than focusing on how many people have tested, some way of tracking how many properties have been remediated in a country in a given year would be more valuable, or equally as valuable as just seeing how many people have tested. And that depends on the country, how mitigators, if there's licensing, I know in certain parts of North America, mitigators have to be licensed. So as part of the licensing conditions, there could potentially be some requirement to feed back on number of properties mitigated. In Europe, I don't believe that is currently a requirement anywhere, and certainly it's not in the UK. But I think that would potentially facilitate tracking action against campaigns to see what's been successful.
So again, mitigation is the final goal, not only testing. Yes. So on what, according to your opinion, should future research related to radon and also to norm focus? Which assumptions are worth to investigate? So assumptions, for instance, you said before that you are using the people, these very important people, that they communicate the message and so on. This has never been tested up till now.
I think that would be useful to have the same message and have it said by a government body. So do some A/B testing. So have a government body put out a same message, and then have a celebrity try and say the same message, the same information, but coming from someone, a public face or a persona that people recognize, rather than someone that they might be standoffish and a bit wary about. This is the government telling me to do this. How's that message received? So I think that would, be definitely of interest.
So this assumption would be worth to test. I can only tell you we did this kind of test from the nuclear emergency communication, and the results were really surprising. Doesn't matter who's communicating, it's important that it's communicated. So even industry, representative of authorities, first responders, all of them, they had equal power to communicate the things. The problem was that a lot of things are not communicated. So it would be good to test this. I will ask now also Professor Neil Weinstein on what should future research related to radon and norm focus, and which assumptions, according to you, are worth to be tested.
Oh, I've mentioned the need to look beyond awareness and knowledge to intervening processes and variables. I think that one of the biggest suggestions I can make is that we look beyond radon to other risk behaviors that have been studied for longer, much longer. Ones like cigarette smoking, cancer screening, vaccination rates. There is a large body of literature, and they have a lot to tell us. I'm sure they would have a lot to say about who the speaker is. And as Rebecca was talking about doing a study to compare different kinds of speakers, I bet there are thousands of studies in the attitude change and communication literature on that, but not necessarily any of them done by people studying radon. So there's a lot of useful knowledge that would be low cost knowledge. So the next webinar like this, I think you should invite someone who studies some totally different kind of hazard. And Tanya, you mentioned a new radon journal. Maybe periodically someone coming from a different risk arena could contribute a review article to broaden the scope of what people studying radon take into account.
Fantastic idea. I think that we have today also editor of this journal online. He will pop up later on a bit. So Boris, what do you think? What should future research related to radon and norm, also please don't forget on the norm, focus on, and which assumptions are worth to investigate?
Well, I think the list is almost infinite of assumptions you could investigate, but I want to point out to three mainly related to radon and norm. So for me, our approach now, or since a couple of years, is to consider radon and to look at radon and try to communicate about radon as one of the elements of indoor air pollution, of indoor air quality. So to look at it in a more holistic way instead of from a point of view of radiation protection, for example. So this is an assumption. We think it's okay, it's correct, but I haven't read a paper about it studying this from a social science point of view. So I think the involvement of academical research like Melissa and Sophie and Christy, everybody like you are doing can contribute to this by studying this assumption. Is it valid? Does it help? How do we need to spread the message in this context and so on? And for norm, it would be more for me, the presentation from Catrinel showed that the risk perception and of the population living near or on polluted areas with polluted with norm waste can be very different. So the risk perception can go from they are very afraid of the radiation from the site, or they don't care at all. And very often it is driven by emotions. If they know somebody who's living nearby who has cancer, they can relate it directly to the radiation. So this is a topic that is worthwhile to be studied systematically with appropriate methods of investigation. And the last one, very short. So the last one is, for me, an assumption that there is some kind of conflict of interest maybe between medical professionals and radon professionals, in the sense that for a medical professional, radon is mainly a smoking problem. If you reach the goal that no people smoke anymore, you will have almost no radon problems anymore. So they see it as a secondary problem and not a focus to focus on. They would focus on smoking. If you solve the smoking, you solve the radon. This is an assumption that is, I think it's very interesting to study and to see how we can overcome this, how we can improve collaboration, because as was mentioned several times, the involvement of medical professionals in the radon communication and in making people behave differently regarding the radon, that means testing and mitigating, is very important. But I feel we miss in many cases the involvement of the medical professionals for this reason. So it's, I think, an interesting topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Boris. It's really pity that we didn't have time to touch this combined effect of smoking and radon, which from communication point of view, it's quite tricky, because with the not well designed communication campaign, we can do more damage than more harm than good. For instance, the research showed that if we communicate combined smoking and radon effects to the people, those not smokers, they will have lower risk perception of radon. So we lose them. People think, okay, I'm not smoker anyway, so it doesn't matter to me. So this is one example how communication campaign, if they are not empirical, evidence-based, if they are not theory-based and strategic, can potentially do more harm than good. David, the final question to you is the same one. What do you think, where the research should go and which assumptions should we test?
I suppose one of the things that's always struck me is we sort of come into this thinking that we're going to make people care about radon. And I do think that a lot of the evidence indicates there's a lot of apathy out there, right? And I think we need to understand more about how people calibrate, I suppose, their understanding of radon and how much they should actually worry about radon versus all of the other things that people are faced with managing on a day-to-day level. I suppose I've always been struck by kind of, we don't really seem to have a good sense of how people weigh up these different risks and how much they're willing to invest in even accepting that something might be a risk to them. So I think there's a very fundamental piece, because I think a lot of the reviews of radon have kind of come back to this idea that, you know, even when you tell people there's a problem, even if you give them free tests, even if you do all this, there's still a wall of apathy, inaction that you're hitting. And it's about maybe trying to understand, at what point do we give up? I know it sounds very terrible, but at what point is this an issue that's best managed by, you know, kind of just regulation and just give up on what we're trying to do? Because even if we invest in high quality interventions, we may still hit this wall. And I think there's a bit of me that does think we probably need to critically reflect on what sort of expectations we realistically can have over how effective these interventions are going to be. Because I said, you know, if you look at a lot of what we've tried, you know, we've reduced a lot of the barriers. We've kind of like handed people these things. We've given no cost. We've called around to their houses, taken them out. We've analyzed them. We've come back to their houses and told them in plain terms, there's a problem. And even still, it's like, yeah, you know, there's an apathy. There's something else that's there. So I think for me, there's a very fundamental piece that we need to think about, which is really around what are the limits of our expectations about the efficacy of these interventions. And I said, at what point do we decide, well, actually the evidence suggests we'll get this many people to hear, but is that enough? And do we need to think then about, you know, that maybe some issues to do with risk are better managed by other means or other means in combination? So yeah, that's kind of a bit of a pessimistic one, but I think there's just got to be a realism within this. I mean, you know, we've over half a century of this type of research. And again, you know, we've noted the kind of methodological problems that maybe make it hard to know over the half a century, what have we actually really learned? But I think there's another side to this, which is what if there is just a wall of apathy we just can't get over and can't get through? So I think there's a very core assumption that I suspect we might want to spend a bit more time thinking about.
Okay, thank you. So a lot of work for us, social scientists, but also with the multidisciplinary and even transdisciplinary approach. I think that we are now in this field, and slowly we will get reliable, validated results to improve the management of radon and norm in the field and prevent consequences of the ionizing radiation. I would like to ask now Mr. James McLaughlin from the European Radon Association, who is also co-organized this webinar, to close down this session. James, are you online? James?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and see you. Nice to see you.
Okay,
so the floor is yours. You can close down this webinar with your final words.
This is so much has happened during this webinar that I don't know where to comment, except to say that this has been a fantastic webinar for me. I've been working in the radon field for half a century, shall we say, and to see young people nowadays, like the PhD students we had this earlier on, it gives me great pleasure to see that the field is now being tackled in the sociological sense, whereas years ago it was purely technical, measurement techniques, remediation, etc., that we had to solve. So I want to congratulate all of the presenters. A few points, if you'll allow me, just to make a few conclusions in my own mind and present them to you. Boris, for example, referred to the fact that it's linked very, very strongly to the smoking side of things, that if you didn't smoke, you essentially wouldn't have a major health risk from radon. But he also referred to the fact that we in the European Radon Association are moving towards trying to integrate radon into indoor air quality, because if there are synergisms between the chemicals in smoking that enhance lung cancer and other diseases, then it would be silly not to expect synergisms between the other pollutants in the air, volatile organic pollutants, etc., that modern people are exposed to in combination with radon. So it's not only smoking, there may be other aspects of synergistic effects going on with the air we are breathing in our homes, even if we don't smoke. I was also very impressed by the practical experience of my colleague, Rebecca, because I think the hands-on practical experience of people like people in her company who meet with the public, we should listen to them carefully. And then finally, it's a hobby horse of mine, I think we in the communications areas dealing with radon, we should cease using very, very strong emphasis on radon being natural. Of course it's natural, oxygen is natural, all the chemicals on the planet are natural. But indoor radon and problems with indoor radon is artificial. It's enhanced natural radiation. The high levels and the risk associated with the high levels that we experience in our homes, in such homes, is due to the way we locate, design, construct, and use our buildings. So it's artificially enhanced natural radiation. So suppress the emphasis on natural and explain to people that the lifestyle, the building of the house, etc., and we can fix it. So I'll conclude by saying that, and thank you again, Tanya, for organizing such a good meeting. Thank you.
Yes, so this webinar has been organized by SHARE platform, European Radon Norm Association, European Radon Association. All together, we will tackle this problem in the future, maybe much better. Thank you for attending this webinar of the RICOMET conference. At 1 o'clock, you're invited to the norm related webinar. And tomorrow there are still some activities, among others, webinar on the societal aspects of the radon at work. See you this afternoon and tomorrow. Bye.